Hello again, thanks for choosing us. Now, Ghana is in a race to ensure all her oil is drilled before 2050. This is because major oil giants are shifting from the production of fossil fuel to renewable energy. BP, Shell, ExxonMobil, Total, and others have all announced separate dates to reduce the production of fossil fuel and further not explore any in any country between now and the next 25 years. The implication of this is that there will be a lack of capital to invest in oil fields. Chief Executive of the Petroleum Commission, Egbert Fable, tells Joy News' presidential correspondent Elton Brobe Ghana is aware of the development and is working to extract all its reserves. He spoke to him on the sidelines of an ongoing international conference on energy in Guyana.
The clamor for clean energy, the clamor for movement from black to green, is something that on low carbon emission, fuels, it's something that Ghana is very focused on. The president made Ghana's position known during the last meeting in COP26 in Scotland. And so that is the blueprint Ghana has. The Petroleum Commission stands on what the president said, and we are going to keep the focus. I know that the Ministry of Energy, for instance, has already taken the lead and is organizing a kind of nationwide tour to pick views from all facets of society and really synthesize them so that the final blueprint, I should say, will be rolled out.
Now, this revelation comes on the back of comments by President Akufo-Addo describing as unfair calls for developing nations to abandon their recently discovered natural resources to address the dangers of climate change.
For the sake of our generation and that of generations yet unborn, we have a solemn duty to take immediate, bold, and concrete steps to protect global climate from warming beyond unbearable limits. We know it is in our own interest to act to salvage the economic fortunes of the continent, and more so, step our collective efforts to fight decisively climate change. We have till 2030 to stop climate change, and this requires us to deal with climate change more aggressively than we have in the past. However, we're faced with a conundrum. The African Development Bank has stated that Africa will need some $3 trillion United States dollars in mitigation and adaptation by 2030 to enable us implement our nationally determined contributions. The obvious question arises as to how do we finance these commitments, especially as our socioeconomic development continues, unfortunately, to be low. The Almighty has blessed our lands with abundant natural resources, and we believe it would be wholly unfair for the world to demand that Africa abandons the exploitation of these same resources needed to finance her development and help us to cope better with the threat of climate change.
But what is really at stake, and why should developing countries bear the brunt of this global environmental devastation? My colleague Kofi J of our researchers joins me in the studio with some information on this. Kofi, let's start with how much Ghana is getting from its oil discovery, for instance.
All right, so Ernest, let's start with gold, actually.
Okay, let's start with gold.
Some digging on, total exports from, from gold, and this is in billion USD. So in 2016, the cumulative, revenue or exports amount to go from export from gold was around 4.92 billion cedis
in 2016,
and this rose to 5.79 billion cedis in 2017. Then a slight, a marginal decline to 5.44 billion, dollars in 2018. It climbed up again to 6.23 billion. USD in 2019, and in 2020, 6.79 billion USD. Now, we as of May 2021,
we dropped.
Yeah, that's just like 4 months. So it's fair enough that the figure drops to 1.8 1 billion cedis. So the next slide.
Okay. So this is for gold. The next slide we'll look at Oil.
So oil, the next
Okay.
slide talks about crude oil. So in 2016, we started off with 1.35 billion US dollars, you know, a significant increase to 3.02 billion USD in 2017. And fast forward to, you know, 2020, when COVID struck, we were doing 2.91 billion cedis. That was a drop from 4.49 billion cedis in 2019 to 2.9, almost like, you know, half of what we were doing in 2019.
Pre-COVID.
Pre-COVID, actually. And in 2021, as of May, we are done 1.15 billion cedis as of May. Now, if you combine the two, that is crude oil and gold, how much you are getting from the period under review. 2016, we got in total 6.29 billion cedis from export. In 2017, 8.1 billion US dollars. In 2018, it rose to 10.01 billion USD, and in 2019 to 10.27 billion USD in 2019. Now there was a decline. Exactly, probably because of COVID.
Yeah.
To 9.1 billion USD in 2019, and as of last year May,
a further decline.
Because we are looking at just 4 months in the year of 2021, which is 2.96 billion US dollar. These figures are from the Bank of Ghana's, summary data on the countries.
Okay, so we've seen how much you're making from oil and from gold.
Exactly.
Now, this call is coming as a result of the emissions that we know is bordering on climate change. Various countries, various continents we know have contributed significantly to this. Yeah. I know Africa's contribution is very little, but I want you to put the figures to it. So help us understand.
So let's go to the touch screen, the smart wall. And here we have, this is the global picture, the global outlook. We are talking about carbon dioxide emissions, in kilotons. So the deeper the blue, the higher the emission rate.
Okay.
So if you look at areas in Africa, countries in Africa, you can see that the blue is very light, meaning we are emitting less. If you actually do the math, you realize Africa is emitting less than, 3% of the global total. And then places like the Northern America, Europe, and then Asia, they are doing more than 20%, emissions. So let's look at a country like Ghana. We are emitting, this according to the World Bank data, 16,110, kilotons of carbon dioxide emission every year. And then places like, the United States is doing 4,981,300, kilotons of
Can we look at
carbon
China?
dioxide emissions. So China will be somewhere, yeah, that's China. 10.3 million, 10.3 million in a year. That's the carbon dioxide emission China is actually emitting.
And I guess that will be Canada also.
Yeah, we have Canada. Okay, so Canada is doing 574,000 a year, and we have United States, which we've spoken about already. But let's look at Russia. Russia is emitting 1.6 million kilotons of carbon dioxide emission in a year. So
Kofi, thank you very much for bringing us those details, putting the figures to the conversation we are having today on Joy News Prime. Let's go to Zoom now and speak to Bernard Kumar Da, Deputy Programs Manager, Center for Science and Environment in India. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us here on Joy News Prime. You have seen that Africa and many developing countries contribute less to this global challenge. How justified is the call for a restraint in the exploring of its natural resources?
Thank you. Thank you, Ernest, for inviting me. Before I jump to the specific questions, it's very important for the listeners to understand the very concept of energy transitions that currently it's a buzzword everywhere. Everyone is talking about, including the investment community. There is a need of decarbonizations globally. These countries are coming up, wanting to reduce their emissions, and thus have committed the NDCs, National Determined Contributions, under the UNFCCC framework. As the countries commits to decarbonize to reduce the emission intensity, their huge focus on energy, as it is plays an important role, which contributes to more than more than 70% of the emissions.
Okay.
So that is under fire.
Very well.
And that is the crux of everything, why we take about energy transition globally, and particularly in Western Africa, like countries like Ghana. And in terms of what we see inherent in this region is energy transitions. It's interesting. We are seeing a movement where the decarbonization part of course, is materializing, but what we seeing here is slightly different in other parts from other parts of the world, as you have mentioned in the smart screen by your colleague. So the country in this region are mostly dependent on the liquid fuels and less on the coals. So what we are observing, some of the interesting movement that we see in the renewables that are going to start in this transition phase here, particularly in the region, what we can expect is that an interesting play or an interesting play on decentralized renewable energy, as it can help it can help to easily penetrate into the communities. That one can key opportunity we can see, and or we can expect the change in the entire dynamic of renewable energy. So one another point that I want to highlight, the grid is not geared up. The conventional grid is not that geared up for taking or incorporating all the renewable target that has been there in the target of global target. So DRE, mini grid, and its distributed hub models can help to help the communities to get rid of the energy access issues on a large scale, and with the reliable and affordable electricity.
Great. Ben, kindly hold it for me. We're joined by Leslie Dwight-Mensah, who is an economist and a research fellow at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Thank you very much, Mr. Mensah. We have committed at various levels as a country to contribute towards finding a global solution to the myriad of problems related to climate change. We have a document even to that effect. Why should we pick and choose which one to support?
Well, thanks for having me on the show. I think we have to be wary of people and institutions that champion solutions to the climate change problem as if these are solutions without costs. Therefore, I completely agree with the president's characterization of the suggestion that developing countries, including Ghana, should limit or cease, the exploitation of their hydrocarbon resources as unfair. Indeed, I can afford to be less diplomatic and characterize it as absurd. And this is because, as an economist, I weigh cost versus benefits. Imagine this: if we all stopped driving, or cooking, or using electricity, that would immediately begin a dramatic reversal of the warming of the planet. But nobody offers a solution. Why? Because it's ridiculous. Why is it ridiculous? Because the cost substantially outweighs the benefits. And it is this cost-benefit evaluation that should be applied to the various proposals to combat climate change. And in the case of Ghana, for example, if we were to proceed, on this path of slowing down or curtailing or completely ceasing the exploitation of our hydrocarbon resources, what would be the benefit to Ghana and to the planet? The benefits would be infinitesimal because our contribution to the climate crisis is infinitesimal. On the other hand, what would be the cost? We depend on these natural resources for our development, for our economic growth, for public revenue mobilization, for jobs. And indeed, we need to develop our energy resources to power and propel our industrialization. This is exactly what the developed countries did in their quest for the prosperity they enjoy today. The United States, most people will not know this, is the world's biggest oil producer as we speak today. The United States produces more than 11 million barrels of oil a day. The Chinese produce about 4 million barrels of oil a day. The UK produces close to 1 million barrels of oil a day from its North Sea. Why should they not curtail or seize the exploitation of our natural resources?
But Mr. Mensah, the United States you talk about, for instance, has promised to increase its donation to addressing issues of climate change and, in fact, compensating, I beg your pardon, developing countries who may be affected by the measures that will be rolled out. Is that not a sign that there's some issue there, a genuine issue that needs to be addressed?
Well, you know, the big polluters have the greatest responsibility to deal with this supposed crisis, okay? Who has determined that the promised compensation is proportionate to the opportunity cost of abandoning the exploitation of our natural resources? I mean, I would be open to considering a bargain that offers to compensate developing countries proportionately for the entirety of the opportunity costs involved in pursuing this path of curtailing or limiting the exploitation of our natural resources. The compensation has to be proportionate. We could do with the billions of dollars if those that are championing this path are ready to pay up. You know, otherwise, in fact, at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, we have called on the government of Ghana, to expand its investment in the natural resources sector, because we believe the state has to increase its presence in the sector, expand its stake, and through that be able to capture directly more of the benefits for the Ghanaian exchequer.
I'll come back to you, Mr. Mensah, on how we can walk this tightrope, considering that we have major companies, for instance, in the oil and gas sector, planning to exit. But let me speak now to Suleiman Yusuf, who is the Director of Research, Center for Climate Change and Food Security. Thank you very much for your time on Joy News Prime. Can we find a middle ground in this development?
Thank you very much, and a very good evening to your listeners and my colleagues. Finding a middle ground has always been a problem, because if you trace the trajectory or the history behind these conversations or climate change conferences, starting all the way from Stockholm, which was Stockholm in Sweden, as far back as 1972, you will see that every turn of events, the promises that are made, the pledges that are made are never met. And so it becomes very difficult for me to say that it is easier, or for anybody at all to say it is easier to find a middle ground. You see, the danger in all of this climate change issue is what I see in what we call the climate change politics, what we call the prisoner's dilemma, which simply says that if any country were to consider themselves as more important than the other countries or protect only their interest, where everybody is acting rationally to protect their interests, then the entire earth will be at danger. Now, your colleague rightly gave the statistics about contributions of various continents to the phenomenon of global warming or climate change.
Yeah.
But what you should have done was also to match the contributions side by side with the vulnerabilities. Then you would get the picture that the developing countries should be diplomatic and not talk tough like we are seeing happening, because at the end of the day, even though the rich countries are contributing more than the developing countries, the vulnerabilities, or if you like, the effects of climate change is much felt by the weaker countries than those who contribute more. So, I mean, as a logical consequence, you would say polluter pay, the one who pollutes more should pay more. And that is what the climate change accords have been trying to do over the years. And that is why when you look at the individual countries' financial contributions to the financing of climate change, you realize that the developed countries are impressed upon to pay more. And so, for example, a figure of $100 billion was agreed as far back as the Paris Accord. We have not been able to achieve that. So yes, there is an attempt to have a proportionate contribution to the entire climate change financing regime. But you see, when you match, if you want to talk tough and say that developing countries should not concede or should not yield, you would also be endangering these developing countries, because they are the worst hit when climate change becomes very severe.
Exactly.
My next, I think that this conversation should be placed properly in a proper perspective, because I have not heard any country saying that developing countries should abandon the extraction of their resources. What I've heard is that when you look at the COP26, what happened was that the last minute move by China and India to make sure that coal does not become a central issue in the whole deal that was struck at the COP26. So nobody is saying that developing countries should not exploit their resources. What is happening is that developing countries are at the risk of not benefiting from their resources because most of the countries are gradually transitioning to green energy. And when that happens, since we do not have the market to consume what we extract even by ourselves, it means that whatever we extract, we will not be able to consume it and will not be able to sell it.
That is so. And there's actually been some calls for restraint as well. But I'll return to you for your comments to wrap up. Let me go to Bennett and put the question of how do we go around this? You have the developing countries, contributing more to carbon emissions. Africa, the developing countries bearing the brunt of their actions, and yet we are not seeing a commitment by them to compensate. Neither are we hearing a commitment by them to reduce the emissions. How do we solve this?
It's very difficult for the developing countries to visualize this kind of commitment, specifically in terms of phasing out the coal, as mentioned by Suleimana. So in COP26, we have seen there was a pressure from international organizations, and the people were saying that country like India and we need to decarbonize by phase out the coal and all. So it's very difficult. Currently, we are studying a lot on these issues. So we have not concluded. We'll see how soon we can come up with these stories.
Thank you very much for joining us. Let me take your final comments, Mr. Mensah. You are encouraging government to go all out to explore the natural resources, but we have a danger which is quite imminent. We are bearing the brunt of climate change, even though we are not contributing to it as much as the West is. How should government go about this in order to protect us, even as we seek to maximize our resources?
Well, what I would say is exactly what I said at the beginning, that we should be aware of solutions that are framed as if they come without substantial costs. At each point, we have to weigh the cost vis-a-vis the benefits of a proposed solution, okay, and make the appropriate decision. So that's my advice, generally.
Thank you very much. That's Leslie Duarte-Mensah with the IFS. Let me take final words from you, Suleimana Yusuf. The president has made clear statements. He says the interest of the people of Africa will be paramount in making these decisions. Do you think that this is necessarily an agenda by the West to keep us down the ladder when it comes to development?
First of all, as I mentioned, I have not seen anybody saying don't exploit your resources. In the first place, as I mentioned, the West is already moving to green energy. So you should be looking at how to diversify your economy and how to maximize the natural resources that you have in the interim, because in future, these natural resources become useless. So it's not about talking tough, it's about looking at the realities on the ground. If you talk about the interests of your country first, don't forget that when climate change hits, it is you, the weaker countries, who do not contribute much to climate change, that suffers.
Thank you very much. That's Suleiman Yusuf. He's with the Center for Climate Change, joining us on this conversation on how Africa, especially Ghana, how we can harness our resources even in the face of climate change and its challenges. You're watching Joy News Prime with me, Ernest Minister.